Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Providence College. This is the first of two lectures on moral reasoning. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about analysis, interpretation, and experience, and that will lead into a discussion of overcoming some forms of resistance in moral reasoning part 2. As an overview of what we're doing in this lecture, I'm going to talk about the types of moral reasoning that we can include. Then I'm going to go through the 3 steps that a professor of philosophy has come up with in terms of helping us to develop moral reasoning. I'm going to look at some forms of resistance and end with a discussion of doublethink. To begin then, we want to talk about 3 levels of moral reasoning. Here we have experience, interpretation, and an analysis. So to begin with, we want to talk about experience. When we talk about experience, we're talking more than just about sensory experience, that I see a gray couch right now, that there is a purple towel waiting to be folded, that the temperature is mildly cool, that the water tastes good on my throat. So we're talking also about what's reported to us, perhaps in the news, in history books, from other philosophers, theologians, from religious sources, etc. And we're also talking about our internal senses. What are our intuitions telling us, etc. So when we begin to think about our experience in terms of moral reasoning, what we want to do at the first level is simply describe our experiences without interpreting them. So if you come across a difficult subject to talk about, abortion, euthanasia, who to elect for president, the first thing you need to do is simply take a moment to describe what your experiences are without trying to interpret them. And so I want to give you an example here of just imagining that you're talking to someone at work and they tell you that their father is ill and that he needs some help, and they're thinking about putting him on a respirator, even though he has a do not resuscitate order. The first thing that you want to do is, of course, listen to your friend and respond, but also describe your own experiences without interpreting them. How do you feel about what your friend has said to you? It's only after we are able to describe those experiences that we can move to the second step. The second step is interpretation, so making some kind of sense of our experience here. And of course, we can rely on individual interpretations, so what our other friends have said to us, what our parents might have said, what our family members, our spouse might have said to us. But we can also talk about cultural interpretations. And so we might wonder, well, what does this experience look like within this culture or within that culture? From what cultures do I come from, and how do those cultures respond to this kind of experience? How does it help me to interpret this experience? Here we can think about 2 different ways of interpreting this, and that is the worldview and the paradigm. A worldview is simply how our interpretations of experiences taken together fit. How do they work out together? And so if we are pessimistic, that might be a particular kind of worldview that we have. Similarly, optimistic might be a particular kind of worldview we have. We might think about our political position as a worldview that we might have. And of course, there's lots of variations in worldview, and I'm talking specifically here about the individual worldview. There might be cultural worldviews, we might talk about religious worldviews. And again, we don't want to say that everyone that belongs to this culture is going to have this worldview, or everyone who belongs to this religion has this worldview. But it is a way to at least begin to think about how to interpret the experiences that we have. A paradigm, in contrast, is an overall way of regarding and explaining a particular phenomenon. In the modern world, we have various kinds of paradigms. So we have the naturalistic scientific paradigm in which we interpret experiences through the scientific language. So we might talk about how love is associated with a particular chemical in our bodies. And that might contrast with a different kind of paradigm, the way that we think about love within literature or love within religion. And so we want to be aware of the different worldviews and the different paradigms and how they might conflict and also how they might integrate to help us to define our own particular worldview. And once we have that, then we can go into an analysis. And here we begin to examine our interpretations, our worldview, and paradigms. And what I mean here is we begin to ask questions that might reveal some assumptions that we had that we didn't really know that we had. So assumptions about how we see individuals or how we see a situation. What is a soul? What do we mean by that? How do we understand nature? Is it something that is an enemy of human life, or is it something that helps give human life? How do we see war? Where does that fit into our worldview? Where does honor fit into our worldview? Um, so here, worldviews are heavily influenced by our upbringing and cultural norms. Obviously, we've all had parents and family who have helped shaped the kind of worldviews that we've had, and we have live in a culture or various cultures that help shape these. And so we might begin to tease apart some of the ideas that fit into this. So when I think, for instance, of the Confederate flag, I often think back to the television show The Dukes of Hazzard, which had nothing to do with race and had a lot to do with resistance to authority. And so I have to question whether that is the way that other people might see the Confederate flag. Analysis then helps us to separate out unsupported opinions from facts and well-supported opinions. So we might be talking about the meaning of life, or we might be talking about what is death, and where does opinion and fact differ. Now we want to be careful about using the claim that's just your opinion, because of course any belief we have is just our opinion. If I believe that men landed on the moon, that's just my opinion in some sense. On the other hand, I can support it with facts that I believe, or I can support it with other well-supported opinions. So don't get hung up on that kind of language. And if you begin to say to someone, or they say to you, that's just your opinion, you know you need to stop there and step back from the emotional connection you have to this argument and go back to the analysis and the interpretation of your experience. What we're doing here then is looking at our interpretations to come to a better understanding of the situation that we might be experiencing. Now, this brings up the concept of epistemological privilege. This is a fancy term that simply means that some people might have better access to knowledge or know a little bit more because they are not indebted to the dominant paradigm in the same way that someone else is. So more specifically, it's the idea that people who are not indebted to this paradigm are least likely to buy into or defend the interpretations that oppress them. So when we look at different paradigms, we might begin to question, do I benefit from this paradigm in some way that makes me less likely to question it? Okay, so as a man, I have to often check my own epistemological privilege here to ask how a woman might see a situation. And we see some of that discussion in many types of situation. We can talk about abortion, but we could also talk about the sex culture and the rape culture that dominates the world. When we uncover an ideology, what we're doing is we're uncovering an overarching idea that masks our own interests and causes us to define ourselves according to the dominant paradigm. An interesting example of this is the book Welcome to the World, Baby Girl by Fannie Flagg. And it tells the story of this woman who doesn't know what happened to her mother, who seemed to just disappear when she was 10. And it turns out she uncovers the fact that her mother knew that she had background that was from Africa, that was black in her bloodline, and this drove her to such an extreme that she ended up killing herself. And so there was a mask there that kind of hid her own interest from herself that led to this kind of execution. And so we might think about how the ideas that we have might be influenced by the interest that we have. If we're wealthy, does that make us more interested in tax cuts than perhaps is legitimate? Now, when we talk about paradigms or epistemological privilege, we can also talk about how praxis or action can shift a paradigm. So that moral analysis is not simply something we do in the classroom or that I do in my armchair in my house, but it's something that leads to change. How do we begin to examine a situation in an honest way that we might be open to change? Now, we may not in the end change, but in fact, we may come to a change by recognizing that our interests have caused us to see things in a way that we wouldn't normally accept. So a philosopher named Mullet has devised 3 steps to this, and I want to just briefly go over those. The first is increasing our own awareness and experience of the pains of others. In the 70s, we might have called this consciousness raising, but it's simply the idea that we begin to think about how other people might be impacted by our actions or our words. So when I took my kids when they were very young to a restaurant, I overheard the cooks and the waiters talking about how they would never take their children to restaurants. And that seemed to me to come from a lack of sensitivity because, of course, adults with children need to be able to get out of the house and not have to cook all the time as well. We might also experience an ontological shock. So let's not let the term ontology frighten us. It just means our ideas about the underlying nature of reality. And this can come into a shock when we meet something new. So for example, when we realize that maybe using the term gay is not something that is really relevant to a situation and can be harmful to other people and can hurt their feelings. And practice is informed social action. So Marx is famous for saying that philosophers have always only described the world, the point is to change it. And the educator Paulo Freire says that through thought without practice is empty and practice without thought is blind. So here we're encouraging action in the world, but action that is informed by thinking about what it is that we're actually doing. So there's a need to act upon the world in order to change our worldview. So through these 3 steps, first, increasing our own sensitivity to the experience of others. Second, having an ontological shock where reality hits us in a way that we begin to question our own paradigms. And then third, through action, being informed about a social cause can help us to shift our paradigms. Now, what that means is a paradigm not only helps us to interpret the world, but it also limits the kind of answers that we can ask about that we can accept about the world. And so, when we shift our paradigm, we open up our questions to new kinds of answers. So today, it's often easy to think, particularly with the kinds of movies that we see, that the human mind works like a computer. And if we shift our paradigm, we might begin to see different ways of thinking about the human mind that helps us to understand where emotions and where mental problems come from that may not just be biological or may not just be the computer acting wrong. So in this first lecture on moral reasoning, I've talked about the types of moral reasoning, so experience, interpretation, and analysis. I also talked about 3 steps to challenging our own paradigms, which include moral sensitivity, ontological shock, and praxis. In the second lecture, I will talk about different forms of resistance and also doublethink.